title is How to Lead a Meaningful Life in the Face of Constant Change and Uncertainty. So we're going to start by finishing up a little bit of what we started in the, we were talking about in the second session, which was investigating the first two noble truths, truth of suffering and the origin of suffering. And I wanted to, in particular, take a closer look at this idea of how the mind works. And based on that understanding, a clear understanding of the different components of how the mind works, then we can have a better understanding of how karma works. Right? And so understanding karma is very, very important in terms of setting up the foundation for our happy life, right? In order to have a meaningful life, you know, in the Buddhist sense, you really have to accept and have great faith in this idea of karma. So after that, we're going to take a look at, in greater detail, this idea of impermanence and death. And then those are, of course, related to the idea of karma. And so by creating causes of virtue, then we ensure that this life and future lives will be positive, and the opposite, right? And so then we're going to spend actually most of the class talking about solutions, in the sense of how to cope with change, what's like a more healthy or realistic way of looking at this idea of impermanence and change, and a couple of different approaches from, I was going to say contemporary writers, but maybe that's not quite right. But that's sort of this solution-oriented aspect of this presentation. Okay, so that's what we have planned for today. So let's start by just taking a minute to rejoice in our ability to come together and learn more about the inner workings of our minds, to understand how we can find and create, you know, meaning in our lives, how we can put every moment of this precious life to good use, changing our fundamental orientation, which is one of pointing, you know, just at ourselves, to instead pointing in a very expansive and universal manner, finding happiness by embracing all sentient beings. And by studying the teachings and understanding, you know, the importance of how and why this is possible, by developing strong faith and conviction in the path that's been so clearly and carefully presented by all of our teachers. Then when difficulties arise, as they often, or they will, because that's the nature of samsara, through our practice and meditation and training in mindful awareness, training in mental vigilance, being able to watch, observe, and train, then no matter what arises, if we have a realistic perspective on what we can and can't, control and not control by setting realistic expectations and based on our foundation of mindfulness, then we're in a better position to transform whatever happens to us into a teachable moment, into an opportunity for spiritual growth. And so with that in mind, we think of the beautiful prayer of the four immeasurables, right? Thinking that since all sentient beings are in the same situation as us, then how wonderful it would be. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from desire and hatred. And for each of those aspirations, each of those wishes, we generate the intention, the aspiration that we ourselves, may I myself be able to ensure that this comes true. May that be my life's work. May this be my ultimate aspiration. So in the last two sessions, we talked about the first and second of the Noble Truths. So the truth of suffering and the causes of suffering. And we learned how our innate, survival instinct is connected to a mistaken sense of self, right? Kind of like a fictitious sense of I. It's like a persona that we believe in and that we work very hard to maintain. It's an ever-changing persona or identity that we carefully, craft. And I think it's helpful to look at, what the traditional teachings say in terms of exactly how, what exactly is the mind, and just on a more, kind of like basic level, when we talk about the self, well, what is the self, right? We talk about the 5 aggregates. So let's just take a quick look at the mind, right? So, and I'm just quoting this from an excellent book by the Dalai Lama. It's the second in a series of in-depth explorations on the different aspects of the Buddha's philosophy. So he writes about it's a definition of the mind and the mental factors that go along with the mind. So again, this might be a review for some of you, but I found this really, really helpful. So consciousness, so consciousness involves two components, right? So a moment of consciousness includes the mind and the accompanying mental factors. And consciousness, a moment of consciousness has the qualities of being clear and aware, right? So it's the ability to perceive an object and this object. So mind refers to the 6 engaging consciousnesses. These are like the doors through which, we bring objects into our attention. So it's the 6 engaging consciousnesses with the within the continuum of any living being, right? So it's not just human beings, any being that has a mind. And what's important, what I wanted to point out, is it's the mind which accumulates the latent potencies of experiences. So mind in general, that's what accumulates the potencies, the karmic imprints, all of our experiences, all of our habits, these karmic impulses, these karmic urges. So that's mind. And then, so there's 3 terms that are slightly, can be teased out slightly differently, but all kind of come down to the same thing. So that was mind, right? Then mentality is that which functions to cognize, its object, right? So we said the consciousness is clear and aware, clear and knowing sometimes. So consciousness is that which knows or differentiates, the different objects that it comes into contact with. So that's mentality. So mentality is the ability to cognize. And finally, consciousness. Consciousness takes it a step further, and it's able to identify different aspects of the object. Okay. So another more simple way of thinking of these 3 terms, which is also a good presentation. Mind is that which is the ability to, or has the ability to accumulate the latent potencies, right? The accumulation of karmic potencies, the negative afflictions, all of that operates at the level of the mind, okay? Mentality is like the basis for all of this, kind of like a container, I guess. And consciousness is what is based on it. So anyway, so this is a better example where I think this will come together really well, this idea of how the mind comes together. So if the example is of a flower, right? So if we're looking at a flower, there's like a general mental experience of looking at a beautiful, flower, right? We're looking at a flower. So there's like a basic awareness of the flower, right? But then when you see the flower, right, with your visual consciousness, right? So there's a feeling that arises simultaneous with this presentation of the flower. And that feeling, can be either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then another factor is discernment. Okay, so discernment is that capacity or aspect of the mind that says, it looks at the particular attributes, like, it's a pink flower. It's of a certain shape, right? Certain fragrance. And then intention is the aspect of the mind that brings your attention, focuses it draws your mind to the object, right? So that's intention. And that comes, I'm going to talk about that in greater detail later. So that's a very important point. Intention moves the mind and the associated mental factors. All of these are called mental factors. The feeling, discernment, intention. Okay, these are all different aspects of mind. It moves your attention towards, the object and holds it there. And attention, the next one's attention. Attention directs the mind to a specific object among several objects. So, there may be, 15 different flowers in the bouquet, and you have like a general sense of the bouquet. But let's say, you just focus on one particular red rose in the bouquet, right? Because it's Valentine's Day. So you're looking at a beautiful red rose, one particular one that you're honing in on, let's say. So it's attention directs the mind to a specific object among several objects. So this is, the next one is contact. Contact is the fundamental capacity of the mind to bring, it's kind of like it draws the, I was going to say glue, but maybe that's not correct. It causes the mind to encounter the object. That's what the text says. It causes the mind to encounter the object, through, I guess, through any of the doors of the senses. And the mindfulness, I guess the actual definition of mindfulness, unlike, the ways that we sometimes use that word, mindfulness is just what causes the mind to hold the object without forgetting it, right? So actually in Tibetan, it's like trempa. It means like, to remember, not to forget, to remember the object. So you're holding on to that, particular red rose in the bouquet. And concentration causes the mind to stay placed on the object. So it's a little more, if you think of attention versus concentration, my understanding is that concentration is kind of like a deeper, firmer grasp on the object, on the subject at hand. Okay. So we talked about this idea of like a main mind being in conjunction, working in conjunction with these different aspects of the mind, these different mental factors, right? And so they're all working together, looking at the same object at the same time, but seeing it, according to their own respective roles and capacities. So for example, the main mind would cognize the object as a whole, right? And then we talked about how like mindfulness would be the factor that allows you to stay with the object and not forget it. So then honing in a little bit more on this idea of intention, right? So one of the mental factors is intention. It's the mental action that actually conditions the mind. So this is important because it has the function of making the mind engage in virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral actions, right? So we, in Dharma world, we talk about setting your intention, right? So this is, very, very important. This is something that we have control of and work with all the time, right? So the function is to engage in either virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral actions. So it has the function of motivating actions of thought, body, and speech. So those three, the mind, body, and speech. And so the analogy is of a magnet. Just as a magnet moves iron, this mental factor's ability is functions to move the mind, right, towards virtue, non-virtue, or neutral action. So that, is what has a direct impact on how we, express our intention. It takes the form of, it can be expressed in terms of further thought, or a physical impulse or verbal impulse. So that's all intention. So I'm going into this in detail because I just got really curious about this whole idea of karma and karmic impulses and the resulting expression of our actions. So for some reason, I got very curious about that. So I thought I would bring that up because it has a lot to do. I think it's very relevant to this idea of how we look at, the circumstances that we find ourselves in and how we can look for solutions, how we can change. So So let me continue with this, finish up this last thought. So when categorized in terms of the in terms of the sense faculties, which are the bases, right? So there are 6. We're still talking about intention, which is just fascinating. Ranging from the intention that arises from contact involving the visual sense faculty, right? So there's going to be intention associated with each of these, to an intention that arises from contact involving the mental sense faculty, right? So from among the 2 types of action that is intention and action that is intended, right? Action that is intention and action that is intended. The first, action that is intention, refers to an intention that is concomitant, goes together with the mental consciousness it accompanies. And then action that is intended, right? Action that is intended is the body, action of body or speech that's motivated by that action that is intention, okay? So in Gyumei Khyentse Rinpoche's teaching on Shantideva last Sunday, he was talking about this particular topic, intention, and he made this distinction between action that is intention and the action that is intended. Right? He was talking about the arisal of a virtuous state of mind and the resulting actions of body, speech, and mind. Okay. So all of this comes back down to the idea of karma. And so, as I mentioned earlier, right, so karma is very, very important to understand because it's the basis of ethics. Right? And so if we don't understand or we don't have faith in this idea of causes, conditions, giving rise to effects, then the idea of ethics, you know, pretty much has no meaning, right? Because then, if there was no karmic cause and effect, then you could do anything, right? Then we would be able to. There would be no consequences of our actions, and so we could. There wouldn't be the 10 virtuous and non-virtuous, you know, actions, right? You could do anything. You could kill somebody, and then there would be no repercussion in this life or the future lives. So. And this comes back to the very definition of samsara, right? So what is samsara? Samsara is the state of being chained by our karma and our negative emotions, our mental afflictions, sometimes also translated as mental afflictions, actually many different translations. So that's what, you know, the truth of suffering, origins of suffering, all comes down to the same idea of samsara being a state of being chained by these two powers, these two forces, which are the forces of karma and our negative emotions. Right? And so what I wanted to, you know, emphasize particularly, yeah, actually in application to both of those two factors is that they're very much a result of the force of our mental habits, right, of our attitudes. And these habits, or these mindsets, I guess is the way of thinking about it, right? These mindsets, these attitudes are things that we develop, not just in isolation, right? They're very much the product of our environment, of our culture, of our society. They're sort of like this group mindset. But, you know, we have control over how we then identify these habits and the steps, that we take to overcome these habits. Right? So we have a choice whether or not we have the mental habit of, like waking up in the morning and generating bodhicitta, right? Making that the first thought that arises in our mind. That's a habit. You get up and think of sending out love and compassion to all beings throughout the universe, right? Or you can get up in the morning, and just be kind of grumpy and think, oh my God, it's snowing again. And, oh no, I got to go shovel the driveway, all that stuff, right? So those are choices that we make, right? We can either practice, over and over again, training in this idea of generating love and compassion, making our first priority, living for others, or we can sink into our customary habits of being more self-centered. Okay. So again, central theme of this whole 4-part class is the idea of choice, right? Choice. It's up to us to make this decision. There's no creator, that is making these choices for us or pulling our strings. We're not puppets on the stage. This is all comes back to our own choices and our own training, our own practice. Okay. So I read probably too quickly, definitely too quickly. A really, really, really interesting book. And maybe some of you have read it because I heard about it through the New York Times. There was an article maybe a month or two ago. There was an interview on the Ezra Klein show. And the book is called Unwinding Anxiety. Unwinding Anxiety. And the author was Judson, what's his last name? Brandon Bransaw. So I'm going to go back to this in the second part of the class. In the presentation when we talk about solutions. Judson Brewer, Unwinding Anxiety. This is a really, really interesting book. It's essentially what he's doing. He's, I think, a clinical psychiatrist, and he's very well known in his field, and very, very good writer. And the upshot of the book is he talks about how worry and anxiety, are so common in the 21st century, and what can we do about it? And his solutions are actually drawn, very heavily from mindfulness practice, kind of the Insight Meditation Society use of practices such as RAIN and breathing, meditation, and loving kindness, and all of that. But his the way he puts his solution for identifying and working with anxiety and worry, how he wraps the identification of those problems together with the solution is really, I think, very, very helpful. Something that we could all practice, right immediately. Something that you can get started on right away, and it dovetails, because this background, I guess, is so deeply. I don't know, is coming from the Dharma. I found that many of the points that he made, and many of the clinical studies that he did, back up, many of the Buddhist teachings. Well, I thought it was a really, really good book. So he talks about the way the mind works, right? And so here we are, we're talking about the condition of samsara, right? The fact that we're in samsara. And see, we're in samsara. So he talks about how there are different parts of the brain, right? So there's this older, more primordial aspect of the brain where emotions such as fear self-preservation, are instinctual. And so, if you're walking down a dark street at night and you hear footsteps coming, then immediately, that sense of tightness, in your chest, your heart starts beating faster, right? You start breathing differently and you start walking faster, right? So that all comes from a certain part of your brain. And there's another part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And I'm not very good. I didn't write down all the different parts and names of the brain, brain parts, I'm sorry. But the prefrontal cortex is a newer, evolutionarily speaking, it's a newer part of the brain, which is responsible for reasoning and logic, right? And so that's what, is the part of the brain that might be able to say, oh no, that's not a bad guy coming with a knife, that's just a child or something, or it would go through some kind of logical analysis to figure out what was really going on. But the problem is that, when confronted with danger, when you're in a scary situation like that, then the prefrontal cortex reasoning, that aspect of the mind, shuts down. And you're left instead just with that more primeval Neanderthal type gut instinct, which in a way is good, right? Because you don't want to sit there and stop and do some, long analysis. You want to just get out of the situation as fast as possible. You want to be able to just run and stay alive. So of these, two aspects of the brain, then the one that's involved in worry and anxiety is primarily related to the prefrontal cortex, that's my understanding. So he talks about how many of us, I would include myself for sure, are experiencing like a generalized anxiety disorder. So this general sense of worry, it's kind of like a chronic sense of worry. Worry meaning more worried about things in the past. This is how he, these are his words. And anxiety meaning more like chronic concern about what's to come in the future, often based on past experiences, right? So there's a two-way street there, I guess. So anxiety can be informed by past experience, and so generalized anxiety disorder. So I think it's that sense that the world is always going to come to an end. Perhaps no matter what we do, but there's that sense of dread and foreboding. And so his method is to identify these negative habit loops, the way in which we get trapped into these patterns of thinking, right? And so by being able to do this exercise of sitting down and then identifying all of these negative loops, that's the first step to being able to break those cycles. Okay, so he talks about identifying three things, and in his book he goes through this, really, really carefully. He gives so many different examples. It's become, extremely clear how to actually do this. So you identify the trigger for the behavior, then the actual behavior, and then the result. So those three things: the trigger, behavior, and result. So for example, one of the examples was you're feeling lonely, you're feeling bored, maybe you're feeling worried. And I'm collapsing some of the examples, kind of mixing them all up in the interest of saving time. But let's say you're feeling lonely. And so, when you feel lonely, what do? Well, there are many different things that you might do, right? So you might eat chocolate, or you might eat a piece of cake, or you might drink alcohol, whatever it is, right? You might go shopping online. So there's some kind of behavior that flows out of that discomfort, that feeling of being lonely and bored, right? So you've identified the trigger, that mental state that arises, that negative emotion, okay? And then the So that's what I think you could think of it as, like a karmic urge or an impulse or a habit that arises from that negative emotion of whatever it is, fill in the blank, right? And then that really is associated with an action, an intention, right? The intended action then is to go out and get a delicious, chocolate bar. That might be conveniently located, in your cupboard. And then the result, could be that you feel good, right? Initially, you might feel really good. Or another example is, I think this is a very common one, is you might have too much work, right? You feel overwhelmed by the amount of work that you have. You have so many deadlines, you're working as hard as you can, but you feel like, oh, I'll never be able to get all of this done. And so, you might procrastinate, even more. You might play video games. You might take drugs, drink alcohol, whatever it is. Again, the behavior is whatever helps you avoid that sensation of discomfort. And then the result in that case would be, since you're not doing the work, that, you actually end up even further behind. And so, the cycle just continues to spiral downwards. And so he talked about, particularly in the case of COVID, he talks about how many of us, again, I would include myself, when we get anxious about the future, we tend to want, more information, right? So we think, oh, wow, this is absolutely terrifying. What can I do, right? And so my first instinct would be to try to do research. So you jump on the computer and you try to figure out, okay, how serious is this variant? How many people have been affected? What's the chances that I'll be affected or that I'll spread it to somebody else? What's the best mask out there? Spent a lot of time researching different masks and figuring out what's a fake mask, what's a good mask. Should I get vaccinated or not get vaccinated? Yet, right? So anyway, the point being that, this the sense of fear or anxiety provoked a behavior, which was to get more information, right? And so particularly in the case of COVID, there was so much, is this true information or is it false information, right? That in itself was a whole nother, opens a whole nother can of worms. And the result was that I didn't necessarily feel any better. Instead of I felt somewhat better, but and I think it was just really confusing, right? Really confusing to be confronted with different types of information. And by spreading, but if you talk about it too much, this really did give us a lot of topics of conversation, right? Without COVID, we'd have nothing to talk about. But really what it did was, in many instances, it just spread the anxiety throughout the community, right? So if you have everybody that's worried about it, everybody talking about it, then it tends to just snowball. Before you know it, everybody's just all worked up. So that was the result. Okay. So just to take a step back, though, his methodology, his recommendation is to just start with a blank piece of paper. So I'm suggesting that you try this. Okay. I started working with it, and hope to. I plan on continuing, because it's you start realizing just how many of these habit loops you have, and I think what I want to suggest is that you can also use this as a way, as you identify the negative habits, you can also, by writing it down, definitely you can clearly set the intention, the aspiration to generate a different outcome, right? And that's what also, I think through his book, that's what he's suggesting as well. So nothing original on my part, but again, to identify the trigger, whatever it is, the behavior, and then the result. And then we'll come back to this more in later in the presentation today. But just to set the to talk a little bit more about this the idea of suffering and the nature of suffering, then I thought that this kind of identification of negative habit loops, mental habit loops, is a really good way of thinking about this. So that's why I shared it. So, here we are trapped in samsara. We now have a better sense of how the mind works, right? And I think that analysis that we just talked about, that presentation of the mind and the mental factors, is also really important when we start talking about who are we, right? We talk about the emptiness of the self and all phenomena, the inability to identify any inherently existing self, right? And one of the ways that we do this in Buddhist analysis, right, is to go through the different parts of the body, different parts of the mind, and trying to identify, a single thing that we can point to as, an enduring self, right? So, because we don't, on an everyday basis, we don't normally engage in that kind of analysis. We just accept ourselves wholesale, right? Me, myself, and I. We hold on to me, myself, and I, and then we just go ahead and engage in actions, right? We act on the basis of that fundamental misunderstanding, right? And so it's those actions and the results that leave imprints or karmic negative potentialities, negative tendencies on our mental consciousness, on our mind, right? Those imprints. As we talked about in the last class, then very simply stated, when our minds are overcome by force of negative afflictions, strong negative emotions such as attachment and hatred, then the seeds of unhappiness, are going to be sown. And when positive feelings such as love and compassion and a sense of wanting to help others, when those seeds are sown, then likewise, the fruit of a beautiful garden of flowers, will be realized, in the future. So we're reborn over and over again in samsara due to this habit energy, the habit energy of emotions, negative emotions, and karma that are the outcome of ignorance. Right? And so by being able to transform our minds, right, being able to identify those emotions as they arise, and being able to, again, identify these mental habits, these karmic impulses, these urges, by working with them at a very granular level, then we're able to, by setting a very positive intention, emotion, aspiration, then that's the way in which we can free ourselves from samsara, right? So the upshot of this is that we don't have to experience karmic rebirth, being born in samsara over and over again. Right? Again, it's a choice. We can get off the roller coaster. We can get out of the haunted house whenever we want to. But we have to, be 100%, like 150% convinced that samsara is samsara, that this really is suffering, right? And that's, that's a big one. That's a big one, because, gee, you know, most of the time when I'm not worried about COVID, you know, if I'm just sitting and enjoying a good meal, having a nice conversation with friends, etc., it really doesn't seem that bad, does it? You know, it seems like, hey, a few bumps on the road, but maybe it's okay. So that's why the teachings on the truth of suffering, you know, are so extensive. Right. So moving on, you know, back to this topic about, moving on to the topic of impermanence and death, right? So maybe that goes along with the idea of renunciation, renouncing samsara, right? Because we know that our lives, however, you know, pleasurable they may be, or however unpleasurable they may be, all of this, you know, is going to come to a halt, right, with our death. And so there's that famous, you know, quote that the end of collection is dispersion, the end of rising is falling, the end of meeting is parting, and the end of birth is death. So that's what it means to be, you know, in samsara. So when we talk about just suffering, right, there are three different types of suffering, and they're all related to this idea of impermanence, right, of momentary change. So the first is, in and of itself, the suffering of change, you know, the fact that there's no abiding pleasure, but, you know, so that something that seems pleasant, you know, initially, right? So the classic example is eating ice cream, right? So you eat an ice cream cone, and then you eat maybe a second ice cream cone and a third ice cream cone. Eventually, you know, you're going to get to the point where eating ice cream is not going to be so great. And then all the pleasure is gone, and then it's just, pleasure turns into disgust if you have to continue eating those ice creams. By the time you eat the 10th ice cream cone, you will never want to eat another ice cream cone again, right? So that's the suffering of change. So it's a pleasant feeling, you know, it can give rise to, that's mental happiness. But in actuality, you know, we can think of ourselves as being just a painful open wound, right? So having the 5 aggregates is really in the nature of just being one big painful open wound. And that's, you know, taught in the teachings, right? So it's temporarily soothed by cool water, but, you know, quickly that will change again to discomfort and and the suffering of pain. Okay, so actually, this author, Dr. Judd, he actually did a study showing just that. You know, he fed somebody, was it ice cream? It might even have been ice cream, to map, you know, the exact transition from attachment and the feeling of pleasure to the feeling of pain. So he could clinically prove that's true. You know, although, you know, from our own experience, we know that that's true. And what was interesting, though, was that he pointed out that exactly the same aspect of the mind, of the brain, right? That same center of the brain is responsible for pleasure and pain. You know, so the same, I guess he put, like, you know, electrodes into people's brains, and then he could see that area of the brain was the one that was firing, whether it was experiencing pleasure or pain. So anyway. So the second one, so first the suffering of change, the second is the suffering of suffering, right? So that again emphasizes that idea of ourselves being just a big open wound. Suffering of suffering is, you know, like you're an open wound, and then you're irritated, you know, by being exposed to salt water or something. And then the third one, so that one's pretty obvious, right? The third one is pervasive suffering. So it's that neutral feeling. Okay, it's a neutral feeling. It's the condition again of having this being a big open wound, being vulnerable, being subject to impermanence. It pervades, well, of course, it pervades all of our experiences, both mental and physical. So it's the suffering of conditioned existence, as a whole. That's kind of like the bottom line, pervasive suffering. That's a state of being in samsara. Okay. So, just the fact that we have these 5 aggregates, right? The 5 psychophysical aggregates, or sometimes they're called the 5 appropriated aggregates. We have all of the collections. We have the collection of causes of suffering, right? So of course, we're going to experience, misery. So I had a good quote here. Hang on. I got a good quote. Good quote, page 247. So he says, when people have to carry a heavy burden, they will not feel comfortable as long as they have that burden on their back. In the same way, as long as you carry the burden of these 5 appropriating aggregates, this combination of body and mind, you will experience suffering and you will not find enduring happiness. These aggregates are appropriating because they're attached to things of the present and they grasp after things of the future, right? These aggregates are inextricably bound up with the negative tendencies, that is 1, karma and afflictions, which are the causes of the aggregates, and 2, the subtle propensities, which are afflictions in their potential form and which will give rise to karma and suffering in the future. In other words, it's the nature of the appropriating aggregates that they have within them the potential to manifest pain and suffering. Okay. So, and the last point is that even though, overt feelings of pain and discomfort are not experienced all the time, thank goodness, the point is that, we always have the potential. The potential will still always be there, unfortunately. Okay. So that's the pervasive nature of suffering. Right. So that's really important to keep in mind. Okay. All right, so moving on. Okay. So does anybody have any questions so far before I keep going? I've been like rattling on for the last hour already. I'm just kind of blasting through this. Any questions or comments? Or we're moving into solutions here. Half an hour left. So awareness of death and impermanence is important because it helps us, prepare for and accept change, right? So meditation on death in the Buddhist tradition is one of the core practices, right? And the point is, not so much to scare us, right? So it's, I have this really nice quote here. His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote in his book, Approaching the Buddhist Path, the meditation on death is not to provoke and an emotional panicky fear of death, which is of no benefit at all, but is a wise awareness of our mortality that leads us to set good priorities in life, abandon harmful actions, and live ethically and kindly. But in contrast, when we usually think about death, right, at least when I do, it gives rise to an immediate sense of dread, and my negative mental habit loop would be just to, slam on the brakes, right? I just completely freeze when I think about death. I find it very difficult to take any kind of meaningful action when I think about, my own death or the death of, a loved one. I just completely freeze up. So that means that I haven't done enough of my own, homework in terms of thinking about that. What the teachings say, right? And I know many of you have studied this already, but the point is that by thinking about death, by investigating, the sense of self, right, and going through this analysis of there not being an inherently existing self, right, by kind of letting go of our fixation on me, myself, and I, then being able to face death without fear, is done based on this understanding of wisdom, also like a complete renunciation of our attachments, right? If you can give away any attachment to any material possession, any friend or relative, right? If you cut all those ties, then moving on is much less scary, right? Especially if you've worked to accumulate merit, right? If you've led a very virtuous life, that you've directed all of your activities to helping others, and that you have this unbelievable collection of merit that you accumulated with only a altruistic intention, then what's there to be scared of, right? Then you're pretty much guaranteed to go to a higher rebirth, right? And then finally, dying with bodhicitta, right? Holding in mind that sense of, may I in my next life be of benefit to others. May that be my guiding principle. Then with those, different factors in mind coming together, then it's just like, moving from one house to another house, right? It's like not a big deal. And when you think of how many times we've died and been reborn, we're quite good at this. We've done this for countless lives, countless eons. We've been born or reborn. It's like we're really good, got a lot of practice at this. And so we can rest assured that in this life, we can continue that training and ensure that our next life is going up instead of going down, and that our motivation is flawless. Okay, so a good book that came out recently, I think it's by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. It's called How to Face Death Without Fear. And I think there's similar writings of his available as PDFs. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, How to Face Death Without Fear. Very, very powerful collection of writings on this topic. Okay. All right. So there is in the interest of saving time, I'm just going to mention a very beautiful teaching by Joan Halifax. Is she Kempo? Lama Joan Halifax in the Zen tradition, on her upaya.org website. You can find her 9-point meditation on death. It's called, the PDF is called contemplations.pdf. She goes through the 9-point meditation on death, point by point. And it's a really powerful, very lovely presentation that helps kind of a different style of presentation. I found it very, very effective. So you might want to take a look at that. But, I think one other way of doing this is when you think of the Buddha's experience, as a householder, right? When he left the palace and prior to when he was still a householder, right? We know that he went out on a sojourn. He went on like a little day trip. He managed to get out of the palace for a break. And what did he see? He saw a sick person, and then he saw an old person, and then I think he saw somebody who had died, right? And so we can do that, on our own. We can think of our first meeting with somebody who was old. Who was the person that we came into contact with? How old were we? What were we feeling? What emotions arose when we saw somebody who we knew was different from us in terms of age, right? Maybe it was seeing your mother, and realizing that she had aged. And we can think of, how maybe her voice had changed or her skin looked different. Maybe her movements were different. And how did you feel when you recognized that she had aged, right? And that you too, would age and be like her at some point. And likewise, you may have experienced a serious illness or injury. And, you can think, was that a wake-up call in terms of how, how you see your own life, how you spend your days? And then finally, reflect on the loss of somebody close to you. Think of the process of accepting, that loss, the finality of the loss. So death and impermanence, those are topics that are should be something that we reflect on, over and over again. Not something that we just put, leave in a book on the bookshelf. It's something that we really have to think about moment to moment. And so with COVID in the news so much these days, that it's been actually a good opportunity to reflect on our own frailty, our own fragility, our own mortality, right? So we can use it as an opportunity for spiritual growth, as a catalyst, for change. So usually our attitude is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But now, we realize that that kind of attitude is very short-sighted. We need to lay a very strong foundation of spiritual practice, teachings, and meditation, really ideally before the crisis hits, right? So that we're best prepared to be able to move forward. And so we need to have, by doing so, we develop, faith in not just in the teachings, but in ourselves, in our ability to change, in our ability to make good choices. And so there's this great quote by Dzigar Kuntrul in his book, It's Up to You, The Practice of Self-Reflection, where he says, the possibility of change exposes our love affair with ourselves. And no matter how painful that relationship has been, we may suddenly question our ability to change. Most of us like ourselves very much. We're somewhat addicted to being who we think we are. But maybe we could just keep it that way. The idea of change feels like being unfaithful to ourselves. So we resist change and become illogically stubborn about holding on to habitual patterns. I thought that was such a good quote. That's a really good book. Dzigar Kuntrul, I can't even pronounce it. Kuntrul. It's Up to You, The Practice of Self-Reflection on the Buddhist Path. Okay, so let's assume that we're willing to try to change because we're in unbearable pain, right? We've acknowledged, at least to some extent, the truth of suffering. And remember, we can choose to end our suffering at any time by eliminating the three poisons. So ignorance, attachment, and hatred, right? So we've got the truth of cessation. Fortunately, the Buddha didn't just teach the truth of suffering and the origin of suffering, he also taught the truth of cessation, right? And the path to cessation. Okay. So, what is the Buddha's advice? What did the Buddha teach us in terms of breaking free? So it's essentially comes down to living, embodying the Eightfold Noble Path. Right? So that's one way of thinking about it. So it's watching our thoughts, being mindful of how our conduct affects others. We have to be constantly vigilant, watching our minds to catch, even the slightest malevolent thought, right? Turning our minds away from harming others, which often means like protecting ourselves, defending ourselves, putting ourselves first, asserting ourselves, right? When we do that, when we, operate from a me, myself, I mindset, then by juxtaposing, self from others and having self as being of primary importance, then often we harm others, either intentionally or very often, I think it's just accidentally or unintentionally, you just blurt something out. And that's because, most of the time we're actually operating on autopilot. And that was another thing that this Dr. Judd cited in his book. There was a study that showed that like 50% of the time we're just operating on autopilot. So we may blurt something out, even like a racist, joke may just come slipping out of our, tripping off of our tongue. We didn't even really realize that we were saying it. It just kind of just blurted it out, right? Or you're in a meeting and then you just blurt out your thoughts, right? Without realizing that somebody else was speaking, right? All kinds of things. So instead, we need to be watching our minds, right? And so our thoughts and our feelings, are in constant motion. So there's always lots of traffic to monitor. We can intentionally nurture and support positive thoughts, by really dwelling on them, with focused attention, right? Really cultivating them with intention, and taking time to rejoice, in our virtue, taking time to really savor that all the good things that that we do, reflecting on the positive efforts that we make, right? Likewise, we can make a point of being open to receiving kindness and the generosity of others, right? Without second guessing their intentions or, thinking maybe that we're undeserving. Right? So it kind of goes both ways. On the one hand, you're trying to be, and again, Gyaltsen Khensen Rinpoche has been talking about this in his commentary on Shantideva, practicing generosity as being one of the fundamental and most important practices of a bodhisattva is having a mind of giving, right? giving to whoever needs whatever they need, being able to give with an open heart, without, any selfish motivation, without any selfish holding back, right? Miserliness, no sense of stinginess, okay? And then likewise, being able to receive the kindness and generosity of others, right? So for some of us, sometimes it's easier to give than to receive. I think that's really true. So watching our minds, being able to, it's a different kind of generosity, actually. If somebody wants to give you something, then, even if you don't need it, just say, oh, thank you so much. It's so kind of you. You're allowing them to accumulate merit, right? So again, trying to find a balance, though, in terms of, watching the mind, not in an overly, like, don't get anxious about it, right? That could be a negative mental habit loop if we just get, like, I'm trying to focus on my mindfulness practice. I watch my mind so tightly, right? Then the result is, I end up more anxious and then I give up. That wouldn't be good. So being able to find, a good balance is very important. So ideally, we would be monitoring our minds all the time, watching our minds in an open, relaxed way all the time, watching what we say, watching what, the direction that our thoughts are taking. We could, if you can't do it all the time, which is, kind of tricky, you can check in on your mind, it's at regular intervals, which may seem kind of forced, but we could do it that way, right? So you could set up 3 different times a day or whatever, 6 times a day where you just do this, like, touching in, checkup. Okay. So, so some more suggestions here would be to, I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, that's okay. Try to develop, a sense of learning from every experience, right? And seeing every experience that we undergo as like a teachable moment, right? As an opportunity to learn from our mistakes, and rejoicing in that opportunity, okay? Versus, being trapped in a fixed mindset, again, using terminology from Dr. Judd, where he explains that the difference between a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, right? So a fixed mindset is one where we're trapped in this cycle of self-judgment, self-hatred, where we feel very closed down and isolated, right? Versus a growth mindset where you're open to new experiences, you're open to new challenges, and you are willing to keep making an effort to improve. So likewise, when we talk in the Buddhist teachings about purification and confession, right? Those practices are opportunities to acknowledge the mistakes that we've made. These are our teachable moments, right? And we confess in a very safe, protected environment, right? It's an opportunity to learn from our mistakes and move on, and not just getting stuck in this loop of self-hatred, right? Of banging ourselves, beating ourselves up. Oh my God, I shouldn't have done that. I should have done this instead, yada, yada, right? We need to be able to forgive ourselves in the presence of our Buddhas and the Lama. And it's, again, it's not something that we do just when we're on the cushion, but immediately after, we harm somebody, right? Immediately, then we're able to, watch the mind and catch ourselves and engage in, this saying, analyze it, say, okay, is this what could I learn from this experience? What's going on here? So we want to be able to break free from these habit loops, these negative habit loops that tend to self-perpetuate, right? And so you want to break free from being stuck in these, patterns of worry, these patterns of self-destruction, these patterns of harming others. Right? Because that, that in itself is, like sowing the seeds of karma, right? You're creating these karmic tendencies for more suffering, both in this life and in the future. So we have the teachings that can show us how to break free of these, of these habits, right? So the most important point, and I'm going back now into Dr. Judson Brewer, his suggestions from his book, Unwinding Anxiety here, is to his point is that in order for this approach that he outlines, to work, the bottom line is that you have to actually feel the moment by moment change, right? You have to, at an experiential level, you have to be able to feel the anxiety, feel what's going on at a physical and mental level, feel the pain associated with the action, but more importantly, feel the pain associated with the result. Okay, so to give a simple, like the example of the ice cream cone, right? You feel worried, you feel tense, you're bored, you're lonely. The behavior was to eat lots of ice cream. And then the result was, okay, initially you feel, good, right? You get that nice sugar rush. But, if you continue that loop of eating ice cream, eventually, you need to realize that you're going to feel really, really, really sick. And by being able to really focus and hold that sense of being nauseous, being sick to your stomach, it's that experience that is the turning point that will then cause you to look for a way out of that habit loop. How do you break that habit, right? So his point is that you can't just rely on willpower or reading this in a book, that says, oh no, you shouldn't do that, right? You have to physically want to change, right? And when you feel that very, very deeply, then you'll make the effort to change, right? And that goes, hand in hand with the teachings, right? When we really experience suffering, right? And we just talked about the 3 aspects of suffering, right? Then, renunciation, which is turning your back on suffering, right? Giving up attachment to suffering, then true renunciation, and only then can true renunciation, really, really arise. So it's this direct, personal experience of suffering. And he talks about how, rewiring our neural pathways, rewiring the brain is going to take, time, right? This is not something that, you practice this little methodology that he outlines. It's not something that we can expect immediate results from, because, our brains have been programmed, so to speak, over at least for this lifetime, right? Those grooves are deeply embedded in the way we think, right? So it's going to take some time.
Annie, can I just ask you a quick question, because you're on the topic of renunciation, and I hate to like wait and then come back. And I know you and I have been in touch. This is Bree. Okay. So I have great news. Like, I'm starting a new job. I had 2 offers, Annie, and one was to return to a similar kind of job that gave me a lot of suffering, but it pays a lot more. I don't have to worry about my finances, things like that. Or I could get offered a job in which my responsibility was really low. I'm way overqualified. I don't need, the degrees I have. And I chose the second one. And the reason I chose the second one was so that I wouldn't suffer so much. And I felt like I questioned myself. I said, am I renouncing like my attachment to the financial part? Because that was like one of the big parts. Is that an example of renunciation? I just want to also better understand, like, because this is a big choice for me, making this shift.
Yeah, so you're making financial sacrifices, which would impact.
Huge.
Yeah.
It's like it's a very significant cut. It's like, it's going from being comfortable to being uncomfortable.
Well,
But
I think your motivation
but uncomfortable only financially. Okay, so only financially. And so there goes the part where like I feel like I am taking a role. I'll be working with 2 children with autism where I can really contribute something amazing. And whereas I could have taken that other job and gotten by,
but the work wasn't.
If I could have given what I could give at this other job where, I get paid a lot less, but the reason I did it was because I want to help and I wanted to be useful. And so that's been, it was a really hard decision, but I did, I'm trying to like build faith and, in these practices. And it did cross my mind. So that's why I wanted to bring it up to you. Yeah. Like, what do you think about that?
No, I think that's wonderful. That your main motivation is to be able to help these two students. And I think given what you shared about the previous employment experience, and then this really does make sense, and particularly in that context, right? You'll be able to be of direct benefit to these to children. That's what you wanted to do, right?
Exactly. So it relieves my own personal suffering, which makes me more available to be of help to others to,
Yeah, no, that's terrific. I wish you great luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So your talks have been helping. I'll keep you posted.
Okay. So just in the last few minutes here we have, and I'll finish up whatever I don't finish today, then we'll do in the next class. So he talks about exactly like what Bree was saying, right? So being able to change, our focus from self to others, realizing that recognizing thoughts, emotions, and karma for what they are, right? So that's really being able to hold ourselves, kind of at a distance, right? Curiously exploring our thoughts and emotions at kind of like an arm's length, right? Not being so sucked up into them, so overpowered by them that we have no way of not, feeling emotionally upset by them, right? So I'm trying to say that, our thoughts and emotions, they exist, right? For sure, but they don't define me. They are not, identical with me. They're different aspects, but, we're not our thoughts and our emotions. They don't, to the extent that we have a choice in how we control them, how we deal with them, okay? And so the main 3 methods that he talks about, in addition to what I explained earlier, his methodology for identifying, recognizing these negative habits, right? He talks about RAIN, which is, and some of you, I think, probably have heard about these. RAIN is the technique taught initially by the Burmese meditation master Mahasi Sayadaw, which is to recognize what's going on in the mind, to accept whatever experience, is physical or mental, that you're experiencing on a moment by moment basis, to investigate, with a mind of curiosity, open curiosity, and then to note, to be able to just again, to be aware of what's going on, not with a thinking consciousness so much, but just being able to say, okay, I'm thinking, feeling, not saying exactly what you're thinking or exactly what you're feeling, but just to identify the processes that are being that are being felt at any moment, right? So recognizing, accepting, investigating, and noting. And we can try that again, maybe in the next class. And then breathing. So this goes back to the idea of taking 3 deep breaths, right? The breathing meditation, bringing your meditation practice, to the forefront whenever anxiety or whatever strong negative emotion is arising, using breathing practice as a way of centering and finding balance. And then finally, the loving kindness meditation, which is being loving, consciously generating loving kindness, for ourselves. So being able to, say, may I be free from suffering. Going back to the, you could use the same prayer that we did at the beginning of class, the 4 immeasurables, right? May I be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May I be happy. May I find the causes of happiness, and the like. So really finding whatever words, whatever phrases, are meaningful for you, and using that as a way of bringing, comfort and peace to yourself. But then likewise, extending those same thoughts to others, right? So if you're stuck in traffic, somebody cuts you off, somebody honks at you, or whatever, instead of giving way to anger and feelings of frustration, right? You want to break that loop, break that loop, and instead transform it, sending out instead, may you be free from suffering, may you be happy, may you have a good day, right? Even though you cut me off, I know you're probably just in a hurry because you're trying to make a delivery. May you be happy, right? May you get to your destination safely, just generating that good wish, right? And then the benefit, the result is that, you'll feel happy, right? That's a freebie. Being able to just wish somebody, may you truly have a good day, right? That doesn't cost you anything, right? Okay. So, so in order to be able to, I'll just finish with this one thought. In order to be able to give up, these negative habits of mind, by using these solutions, rain or breathing or loving kindness, using techniques such as those, what will change our minds is we're looking for what he calls the bigger, better offer, right? There has to be something, again, to force us to get out of the negative way of thinking, right? To force us to change, right? You're not going to change, right? We feel very comfortable and familiar with our minds of anxiety, right? Why should I change? I kind of like being anxious, or I'm so used to being anxious, I don't know any better, right? Suffering of change, pervasive suffering, right? So I'm not really going to make an effort to change unless, a bigger, better offer comes along. And the bigger, better offer, in his explanation is this, the peace, the joy that arises from having, an open heart, right? From cultivating this loving kindness, right? From being able to, at a moment by moment basis, being able to dismantle these negative emotions, right? And experiencing the relief that comes from that. I think that's what he's saying. Okay, so we're no longer trapped in this, right? We always say that Westerners in particular have a lack of self-compassion, right? Because we're very self-judgmental. And so by being able to, that's what the bigger bigger, better offer is just that, it's being able to find freedom from those traps, right? Okay, so it's 8:31. I don't want to hold you, excuse me, 11:31. I don't want to hold you over. So I guess, we'll end right here. I apologize, we didn't have time for questions, but we can, I think the next class there's less to talk about. So we can do that in the next class, or you can always feel free to email me. My email address is Tendrol, Tendrol 108 at gmail.com. And so, we dedicate, let's take just a minute to dedicate all of the merit that we've accumulated, both in this class and our previous sessions, our intention to be able to get to know ourselves better, to understand our human condition, to understand how we can, put every moment of the day, to good use, to make our lives as meaningful as possible, based in our faith and commitment to the Buddhist teachings. May we do this, just not out of a preoccupation, self-preoccupation, but rather for the benefit, of all beings. May all beings be able to find freedom from the chains of samsara, and may I help them attain perfect state of liberation. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
I'm sorry, could you please repeat your email address? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, I can put it in the chat too.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ani. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you
Bye-bye.
for coming.
Thank you, Ani.